Today's daf is daf tes, and we're discussing the concept of Mosar Pesach, which means a carbon Pesach that is not during the proper time period. It's during the year instead of on Yud Daled ben Nisan. And what do we do with this carbon Pesach? And the assumption of the Gemara is that it's actually used or slaughtered as shlomim. So that even though it was Pesach, and that's how it was designated, nevertheless it becomes a carbon shlomim during the entire course of the year. And the Gemara, if you recall, on Daf Ches Amud Beis had a klal pratu klal. And now the Gemara wants to say the following. Who says that when you shech the carbon Pesach during the entire year, meaning Shalom Bismana, it becomes a carbon shlomim? Maybe it becomes that carbon which you designated. Like, let's say, for example, the Kohen had in mind that this Mosar Pesach should be shechted for a chatos. Maybe it should take on the status of a chatos. And that was the Gemara's last question on Ches Amud Beis, Ema dekol deshochet leila hevi kavase. So the Gemara on the top of Daf Tes Amud Aleph, in the name of Ravin, says the following, of Oven. Dochim kodshim anacholim etzel kodshim anacholim. It makes sense that the carbon pesach, which is a nechal, could be actually redirected as a shlomim, which is a nechal. But ein dochim kodshim anacholim etzel kodshim shein anacholim. To take a carbon that's nechal, for example, a carbon pesach, and designate it as a carbon ola, for example, which is not nechal, that would not make sense. But the Gemara immediately attacks, but otu chatas v'yashim milo misachli. But in the cases of chatas v'yashim, the kohanim will eat the carbon, that part of the basar. So why can't the carbon pesach now become a chatas or an asham? The Gemara now restructures it. Dochim kodshim necham l'chol adam, it's a kodshim nechol l'chol adam, ain't dochim kodshim necham l'chol adam, it's a kodshim she'enim nechol l'chol adam. So that in the case of shlomim, you don't have to be a kohen to eat the basar of the shlomim. Anyone could eat the basar, and therefore it's similar to carbon pesach. But to redesignate it as a carbon chatos or a carbon asham, which could only be limited by a limited number of people, namely the kohanim, that we're not going to do. And this leads us to Daf Tes Amud Aleph, to where we left off yesterday. Rabbi Yossi Rav Ovin Omer. So this is approximately 9 lines down from the top of the Omud. Dochim kodshim kalam eitzel kodshim kalam vein dochim kodshim kalam eitzel kodshim kodshim. You cannot redirect a carbon pesach, which is called kodshim kalim, to become chatos v'osham, which is kodshim kodshim. Maskiflor of Yitzchak bar Rebbe Savrio. I guess his father's name was Savriv. Ema shachte l'shem maser levi maser. Well, wait a minute. Maser is what we call maser behema is kodshim kalim. So therefore, if you shechted this Pesach Shalom Bismano for the sake of a maser behema, it should become a maser behema. So now what changes here as a result of the fact that you call it not shlomim but maser behema? The Gemara says the lo boy netzochin. Maser behema does not require niskei yayin, whereas a carbon shlomim requires niskei yayin. And furthermore, lemilki alei below yigoel. If a person goes ahead and redeems a carbon maser behema, then for doing that act of redemption, he gets malchus. And he violates a lav in Vayikra Perek Chof Zayin. The Gemara Bechoros on Daf Lamed Beis derives from that pasuk that you cannot sell a maser offering to make it into a pidyon and a geula. And here's another difference between shlomim and maser. So now the Gemara has to come up with some sort of drasha, a miut, to established that you cannot redirect a Karban Pesach as Maser Behema. Amakra, the Torah says, Asiri Yekodesh, the 10th animal that leaves the corral will be designated as Maser. And what's the Torah emphasizing here? Zeh Maser. This 10th animal could be Maser. V'yein acher Maser. So Torah's excluded the possibility of a Karban that was designated as, in this case, a Pesach to become Maser. Emo shachti l'shem b'chor levi k'b'chor. Well, what happens if he shechted the Karban Pesach shelo bizmano for the sake of a Bechor? Let it be Bechor. And Lamai Hilchasa, you'll ask me what changes now. Again, Bechor is Kodshim Kalim, like Shlomim. What changes now between Shlomim and Bechor? Deloli Boy Nesachim, number one, that Shlomim normally requires Nesachim, but not in the case of Bechor. And the Gemara Menachos derives that a Bechor, like Maser, there's a very strong hekesh between Bechor and Maser, doesn't require Nesachim. And Inami, furthermore, the Lisvei L'Kohanim. What do you do with a Bechor? You give the animal, after the Shechita, you give it to the Kohanim. And that's not true in the case of Shlomim. I mean, there are parts of the Shlomim like Zrol L'Chayim V'Kev that have to be given to the Kohen, but not all the Basar, like Bechor. The Gemara says now in Bechor also we have a Miyut, Bechor Nami, and this Miyut is based on the Gzeira Shava that equates Bechor with Maser, and that's called Avora Avora, Mimaser Gomar. Right? The Torah says in regard to Bechor Havarta, Kol Peter Echem Lashem, and that's in Shmos Perek Yud Gimel. And if we fast forward to Vayikra Perek of Zayin, there it says Kol Asher Yavor Tachas HaShovet. We're talking about Asiri Kodesh, meaning Maser Behema. Also Yavor. So we have a Hekesh, or shall we say Gzeira Shava, between Yavor and Yavor, to teach me in this case that just like in the case of Maser, we have a miyut to exclude any other Karban, that it cannot become Maser, because the Torah says Hasiri Yekodesh v'lo Acher Yekod Maser, Asiri Maser. So to in Bechor. Affecting Gemara v'yema shachti l'shem tmuri lehevi tmura. What if he shechts this Pesach Shelo Bismano for the purpose of tmura? Shall we say it's therefore has the status of a tmura? And a tmura, which is the substitute animal that was designated to be a substitute for another consecrated animal that was already a Karban. And the Torah says that you're not allowed to do such a thing. And if you do such a thing, both animals are Kodesh. Hu utmuraso Kodesh. So the Gemara is arguing if somebody went ahead and he shechted the Karban Pesach for the sake of a Tmura, then the animal should now require that sanctity. And the Gemara says, what difference does it make if you call it a Tmura? The milking, like first of all, you'll get malchus for violating the Isur of Tmura. Tmura is a lotasa. Inami, and furthermore, make him a label or yimach v'lo yigoyel, because the Torah says that you're not allowed to redeem a Tmura. And although this pasuk itself doesn't refer to Tmura, it's a particular type of dedication vow known as cherem. But nevertheless, if one designates something as a cherem to the Kohanim, it may not be redeemed until after the Kohen receives it. Omar Mar. So again, we still have a question as to why the Karban Pesach Shelo B'Zman of the whole year round cannot be designated as a Tmura. Omar Mar Zutra Breit Rav Nachman Omar Krov Ahoya Hu Utmuraso. Yeah, Kodesh, right? Zu Tmura, Ve'ein Acher Tmura. So we have a special miyut that a Karban Pesach that was shechted as a Tmura cannot become a Tmura. Next question, Ve'ein Mashachti L'Shem Toda Lehevi Ki Toda. Toda is also a Kodshim Kalim, and therefore let it become a Karban Toda. If he shechted the Pesach Shelo B'Zmano L'Shem Toda, L'may Hilchos Lahatim Lechem. A Karban Toda has to be accompanied with 40 lechamim, 40 loaves of lechem, which includes 30 matzah and 10 chametz and so forth and so on. And now, because we redirect the Pesach Shelo B'Zmano as a Korban Toda, now it has a chiv to be accompanied by the lechamim. And the Gemara answers, no, Pesach cannot become a Toda, mi'ika midi the Pesach gufe lo boy lechem, umosaro boy lechem. Right, the original Korban Pesach, had it been on the 14th of Nisan Bismano, would not require lechem. And now you're going to tell me that if it's Mosar Pesach during the entire year, all of a sudden, because he redesignated it as a Toda, now it requires lechem. Ina ihachi hashtanami. So the Gemara objects to this last answer because it says mi ika midi the Pesach gufe lo boy nesachim umosoro boy nesachim. Right, of Pesach, which becomes a shlomim, requires nesachim. Right. So, but the Pesach itself doesn't need. There's no such thing as nesachim on a Korban Pesach. What we're saying is that a Pesach during the entire year, which now, if you shecht, it becomes shlomim, now all of a sudden it requires nesachim. But you just established a logical principle that if the Pesach itself doesn't require nesachim, then the Mosar Pesach certainly doesn't require. I'm sorry, if the Pesach itself doesn't require lechamim, then certainly the Mosar Pesach that was redirected as a Korban Toda does not require lechem. Why not apply the same logic, the same rules and regulations to a Mosar Pesach that was designated for something that requires nesachim? And guess what? You're saying that a Korban Pesach now, Shalom Bismano, becomes a Korban Shlomim, and therefore it's going to require Nesachim, but the Pesach itself doesn't require Nesachim. So how is it that when you redirect it as a Shlomim, now all of a sudden it requires what's called Nesachim? So Gemara says, "Anan hachikami." This is what we really meant to say when we asked the question about Toda. Nika midi the mosar Toda atzma lo boy lechem. Like, let's say, for example, he designated one korban as a Toda, then he got lost. He designates a second replacement korban as a Toda, and then he finds the first Toda. The first Toda has the status of mosar Toda. And Mosar Toda, believe it or not, does not require lechem. And that's based on a Gemara Menachos, which Rashi makes reference to. Right, someone designated a Toda and it was lost. In the interim, he designated another replacement animal as a Toda, and then he found the first one. The original Toda is offered as a Toda. But the replacement, which is also brought as a korban, and that's called a Mosar Toda, is not accompanied by lechem. So that's called a Mosar di Asiluhumi Alma, boy lechem, meaning if it comes not from the lost Toda, but rather from the Korban Pesach, now you're going to say it requires lechem. So therefore, the Mosar Toda does not require lechem, and the Mosar Pesach, which is now being brought as a Toda, can't be required. It's impossible that it would require lechem. Maskif lo Rav Yemer Bereder of Hillel, umimai de Mosar Pesach ksiv. How do you know the pasuk that says that it becomes a korban shlomim? And that's the pasuk in Vayikra. Gimel, pasuk Vav, which says, V'im minatzon karbano l'zevach shlomim l'Hashem, etc., etc. And we're assuming that mizevach karbano, minatzon karbano, is referring to what? To a Mosar Pesach. Dilma b'Mosar Osham ksiv. Maybe the Torah is referring not to Korban Pesach, but rather to a Mosar Osham. Because an Osham is also brought from a Sa'ir, which is included on the Tzon. I'm sorry. An Osham is not from a sa'ir, but rather from an ayal. Ayal is part of tzon, but cattle, which is called bakar and not tzon, cannot be brought as a carbon osham. So maybe the pasuk of min hatzon that we said is in Vayikra Gimel is referring to Mosar Osham, which would mean that he designated animal A as an Osham, lost animal A and designated an animal B as an Osham to replace the original one. Then he found the original one. The second one, which was the replacement, is called the Mosar Osham. And maybe it should be brought as a carbon shlomim. Omar Rava, Omar Kravi, Minatzon carbon ol zevach shlomim, Dovra Shove Bechol Hatzon. So in the case of Osham, you have to bring the Osham from an Ayal, but not from other categories of tzon, like for example, goats or sheep. The only carbon that lends itself to all of tzon, whether it's Ayal, whether it's kvasim, whether it's izim, is only the carbon shlamim. And we're going to derive from the pasuk of iminatzon, etc., shlamim, that we're talking about minatzon, meaning all its own. Now, it's interesting. We're interpreting the word minatzon to expand it to include all tzon, including sheep or goats, as opposed to the carbon osham, which is only an ayal. Well, the word min is never ever used as a ribu. It's always used as a miut. Maske flora of oven, etc. Bechol atar. In Yiddish, we say umitum, wherever you look. Ato amrit min lahotzi. The word min is a miut. It tells you min only this and not something else. V'kan min larabos. Now using the word min hatzon to include all categories of tzon, sheep, and goats. Omar Rebbe Mani. Hochanami min lahotzi. We are darshaning min as a miut. And what does it mean? What is it coming to be memayit? V'lo osi ben shtei shonim. So if we assume that this pasuk is referring to a carbon pesach, then once the lamb flows over, what's the word I want to use? It crosses over the first year of its life, and it's in the second year. It can no longer be brought as a carbon pesach. And number two, lo asim in a keva. You can't bring a carbon pesach from a female. It's got to be a lamb or a sheep or a goat that's male. And therefore, the word minatzon is a miut to exclude from carbon pesach if the lamb is already in its second year. It also comes to exclude a nekeva. And now, Mimela, it cannot be applicable to a carbon osham because the carbon osham doesn't have any of these dinim. Maske Flora of Bagdosa, he came from Baghdad. Umi motzis amrit dechi ksiv hai b'mosa pesach. I'm going to again challenge your premise that this pasuk in Vayikra Gimel of Minatzon is referring to a carbon pesach the whole year round. For Midich Siv, in the same pasuk, it says, let's go back to the pasuk one more time. Im minatzon. And then, in the very next pasuk, it says, Im kesev. Okay, so kesev is a lamb. And it says Im kesev, and then it says Im eis, which is a goat. Is Michlal the lav b'mosar pesach ksiv. Right, the first pasuk says iminatzon karbonol zevach shlomim. It cannot be possibly referring to a carbon pesach, or shall we say mosar pesach. Now here we have a very sensitive point. We'll try to see if we can figure it out. If the first pasuk of Ibn Atzon Korbanos Zevach Shlomim is referring to Korban Pesach, then why did the pasuk afterwards have to mention Im Kesev, and Im Eis? Why do we need that for? We know that from other psukim that a Korban Pesach could only be brought from a lamb, a Kesev, or a goat, an Eis. And that's what it means, Minatzon. Now, this is based on a pasuk in Shmos Perek Yud Beis. It says, Mina kvasim, umina izim tikhu. In the parasha of Korban Pesach, the Torah explicitly mentions kvasim, which are lambs, and izim, which are goats. So why would the pasuk again have to repeat itself if it's referring to Korban Pesach and telling me, im min ha-kesef, im min ha-izim, or im min ha-eiz, I should say, im eiz korbanot. So now the Gemara is going to say that there is a justification for im kesev, im eiz. Right, there's a part of the animal which sometimes is brought on his back, sometimes not. And that's called the aliyah, which is the tail. And the kesef is coming to include that the Korban Pesach, when it's offered on the Mizbeach, they take the aliyah and they burn it on the Mizbeach. Uksha omer im kesef. L'rabos Pesach she'ibra shnasa. Now, Ibra Shnasa means you're already into the second year. And therefore cannot be brought as a Korban Pesach. And the Torah is telling me that it can be brought as a Shlomim. Ushloma boy machmas Pesach. Right? If let's say you have a Mosar Pesach and you shecht it l'shem Shlomim and l'chol mitzvah Shlomim. It's coming to be marba that all the mitzvahs that apply to Shlomim will apply to the Mosar Pesach, which is brought as a Shlomim. But here you have a Tosfos that says that the Chazal are referring here to the Chagiga that's brought together with the Korban Pesach on the 14th of Nisan, and it also is going to be treated as a Shlomim, offered as a Shlomim. And what does it mean, L'chol mitzvah Shlomim? Number one, Shitanu Smicha, it requires Smicha. Number two, Nisachim requires Nisachim. And number three, Tnufas Chazav V'shot, it requires Tnufa, the Shav V'shot. Uksha Omer Im Eiz, what is the ribui of Im Eiz? Hifsik ha'inyan, limen ala eiz she'ena tuya aliyah. So only a kesev requires that the aliyah, the tail, be brought on the mizbech, but not an eiz. Now, we just established, based on this brisa, that when it says im kesev, we're talking about a Pesach that passed its first year. It's already into the second year. It's brought as a shlomim. So we have two cases that are considered similar. One is a Pesach Shalom Bismano during the course of the year, and the other is a Pesach Sha'over Shnasa into the second year. And basically, they both have the same status. They are Mosar Pesach that have to be brought as a Shlomim. So the Gemara says, "Mehacha nafka." Midavur d'shmul nafka, the Amar avur d'shmul, the imin atzon karbano lezevach shlamim, dover abomin atzon yehe lezevach shlamim. So I don't understand. Avur d'shmul is deriving this whole story about Mosar Pesach brought as shlamim from a different pasuk of imin atzon karbano lezevach shlamim. And what's a davar abominat son? That's referring to the Korban Pesach, and it's brought as zevach shlomim. But yet the Brisa derived this from im kesev, im eiz. Now it's interesting. At this point, the Gemara is a Shverkeit, and the Gemara is going to answer that question by raising another question. Right? A good Jew always answers a question with another question. Hakati midir Rav Nachman Omar Rabba Barahu Nafka. Forget about Shmuel's drasha. We could derive this from the same way that Rav Nachman derived it. And how did Rav Nachman derive Minayin Lemosa Pesach Shkar Shlomim? How do we know that a Pesach the whole year round is brought as a Shlomim? Shenever v'zavachta Pesach Lashem Elokecha Tzonu Bakar Pasuk in Dvarim. Shenever v'zavachta Pesach etc. Valo ein Pesach Ba El Min HaKfosim Umina Izim. And here it says Tzonu Bakar. Bakar is cattle like a cow. So we have all these drushes from which we derive the conclusion halachically that a Mosar Pesach is brought shlamim. So why then do we need your pasuk of im min atzon karbonola zevach shlamim? El tlasa kroy ksiva.